You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 5th of July, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The removalists load up in Downing Street, the UK's general election in a global context, and how cooperative is South Africa's new coalition. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily and an election special in-house daily at that. And the Monocle staffers who have not fled the platoons of Red Guards hauling bourgeois revisionists to re-education camps are Tom Edwards, Chris Lord and Christy O'Grady. They'll reflect on Labour's landslide, plus we will take a look at South Africa's unwieldy seeming new cabinet and find out about a plan to revive a sleeping giant of French football. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined first of all by Monocle's head of radio, Tom Edwards, Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord, and Monocle Radio's production manager, Christy O'Grady. Hello to you all.
Hello.
Hi.
Were you all still up for Liz Truss?
Do you mean awake last night to watch her losing her seat, or up for Liz Truss, as in, bring the old girl back, give her another crack at it?
Well, whichever one you prefer, Tom.
Neither, speaking for myself. I don't know about my illustrious colleagues.
I saw the exit poll obviously come in and then hoped it was correct, was worried when I saw Reform had got, at the time of the exit poll, 13 seats, and was relieved to see that they were knocked back down to 4 by the time dawn rolled around.
Well, we will start here in the United Kingdom, which does have, as we have very strongly intimated, a new government. This, though no surprise to anybody who has read an opinion poll in the last couple of years, is nevertheless seismic. Sir Keir Starmer has led the Labour Party from self-destructing rancorous obscurantism to a landslide victory in just 5 years. Labour's traditional rivals, the Conservative Party, end 14 years in power with the worst electoral defeat in their history. Here is a line each from, respectively, the vanquished and the victor.
This is a difficult day, at the end of a number of difficult days. But I leave this job honoured to have been your Prime Minister. This is the best country in the world, and it is thanks entirely to you, the British people, the true source of all our achievements, our strengths, and our greatness.
From now on, you have a government unburdened by doctrine, guided only by the determination to serve your interest, to defy, quietly, those who have written our country off.
That was Sir Keir Starmer as of earlier today and his visit to see the King, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Christy, first of all, it's been quite a weird election because, as I was suggesting, everybody kind of knew what was going to happen. Now that it has happened, as the designated representative of youth in particular at this table, how excited are you?
First of all, thank you for that lovely compliment. Yeah, I am happy, obviously. I'm going to be very pragmatic about this. Mm-hmm. I think that the country is in such a state, it's going to take such a long time. It's going to require fiscal measures akin to austerity, if not austerity itself, which is not going to please the electorate. And I fear that the patience of the people of Britain might not last enough to get... I mean, maybe Labour will win again, but I wouldn't bet my house on it.
The patience of the people of the United Kingdom, Tom, I think it is fair to say, has been tested. And it is quite strange, even when you look back on the 14 years of Conservative, mostly by themselves, government we've had, even if you try to apply the most generous credit where it's due analysis of it, it's hard not to look at it as 14 wasted years.
I think it's a pretty abject failure by whatever metrics you use. The only way they've really sort of put up some impressive numbers is in ensuring generationally challenging circumstances, whether that's with the relationship with Europe, the parlour state of public services. It's pretty extraordinary. But look, that has led to this moment where we have a similarly unprecedented opportunity for, the centre-left party in this country. I think you do. I know this is the sort of bland cliche that everyone's been banding around, but I can only look to the immediate post-war Labour, consensus-building Labour administration as anything even approaching a similar dynamic in terms of both challenge and an opportunity. The really striking thing for me is more that we now have a hugely politically empowered centre-left administration, probably quite Europhile, at a time when we're on the outside pissing in, and several, the Axis powers of federal European the movement are in the grip of drifting way over to the right. It's just such an extraordinary dynamic.
It is. And Chris, Tom there uses the phrase centre-left, and there has been a lot of attention paid to the numbers piled up by the Reform Party, which you alluded to at the top. In their first general election, it looks like they will only win 4 seats, possibly 5, but that belies actually genuinely, impressive / horrifying numbers across the country. But because of the quirks of the UK electoral system, they will be a very marginal presence in Parliament. So a lot of attention has focused on that, but I do wonder if we may be missing the wider point, which Tom alludes to, which is that nearly 500 seats in this House of Commons between Labour and the massively resurgent Liberal Democrats, 500 seats out of 650 will be occupied by basically centre-left parties.
It's been interesting to watch this overnight, Andrew. Before I moved to the United States, one of the last jobs that I did for a different broadcaster was to go and cover the Labour Party conference in 2021. At the moment when Starmer was trying to rebuild the centre of the Labour Party, trying to draw back from those years of Jeremy Corbyn, and essentially trying to assert some authority at a moment when lots of people were saying to him, this has failed already, you should leave, pass the baton, it doesn't work, the centre doesn't work anymore, this isn't what Labour stands for, and it won't speak to the electorate in that way, despite the 2 failed elections of Jeremy Corbyn previously to actually get over the post and get a Labour government. To have seen those years pass and how that has been rebuilt, partly through ruthless politics on the side of Starmer. I mean, however you square it, he is a ruthless operator, which has, yes, rebuilt that centre. And I wonder, ultimately, once we get into government and once he's there and once he's sort of having to kind of manage the actual realities of things, how that might start to crumble a little bit, that strength, that discipline that he's built back into the party a little bit. You have different voices, have different demands from the electorate. But I think to your point about centre-left politics, we are as Tom mentions, we're in an extraordinary moment now, a reversal, if you like, of the way things have been for the last few years, where I suspect people in France who yearn for centrism and elsewhere in the Netherlands and so on probably are looking at this and wondering whether they've opened the Pandora's box that Britain has been in, frankly, since 2016 when the Brexit vote happened. And I think, my big sort of concern here, I think, is that while that Labour manifesto is centrist in many ways and with some pointed things towards the left, I think there are still those big glaring questions around our relationship with Europe that, frankly, I know Starmer has ruled out rejoining the customs union, rejoining the single market, all that stuff. But there is a reality check here. And unless that relationship is fixed, we're not really going to reopen some of the opportunities to expand the coffers of the country, frankly, that we need to do and make this look business friendly as he wants it to be.
Christy, as Chris says, Starmer was at pains mere days before polls open to absolutely stand on any idea of attempting to rejoin the European Union or even the single market or the customs union. And again, going back to what Chris was saying about him being a ruthless operator, you can kind of see the politics of that. He did not want to reopen that argument just ahead of election day. He did not want to discuss Brexit because he knows how divisive it is, and he wanted back those Labour seats in the north that voted for Brexit. Do you have any hope, though, that maybe 4 or 5 years from now, as he tees himself up for a second term, if the opinion polls on EU membership keep tracking the way they have started to track, that he might at least start talking about, well, why don't we maybe think about the Norway-Switzerland kind of option and see how that works for us?
Yeah, I definitely think he's possibly the kind of leader that reads the room. I think that's what I've kind of gathered most about him, is that he's very good at taking a temperature check. I don't know necessarily, though, that it's at the top of his agenda. I think he's probably more focused on fixing the domestic issues, like the cost of living and the things that the voters have very loudly articulated. And also, I think he might also still fear approaching a second election of angering, as you said, those voters who have become swing voters, if you like, up in the north. Also, as well, I think, the temperature in Europe at the moment is possibly not exactly EU friendly anymore, or as unified as it was. So I don't know. I think it's a case of also seeing where the land lies outside of these borders.
Tom, we should talk about the vanquished, because they will doubtless be serving up another helping of hysterical psychodrama as only the modern Conservative Party can fairly shortly. Rishi Sunak will not be the next leader, obviously, or will not be continuing in that role. It strikes me, at least, that what the Tories now face is a decision about whether they do try to once again, assert themselves as the sensible, phlegmatic, pragmatic, non-horse frightening voice of Middle Britain. And Jeremy Hunt, for example, the former Chancellor, did survive just and may be a plausible figurehead for that kind of approach. Or they can, of course, go full Yahoo.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I just don't know if they've got the personnel left to do either of those things. It reminds me a little bit of sort of potential bifurcation that you had of the centre and the left in the early 1980s, a kind of Gang of Five, the formulation of essentially a new party. And if you look at what was broiling around, I'm going back to sort of the SDP and that movement which was sort of unfolded through the late 70s and early 80s. I wonder if something like that might happen. I think that Reform's presence might ultimately be helpful, because they're the sort of batshit right-wing headbanger outliers, and so that's sort of they're the sort of cautionary tale, and their presence within the actual House of Commons, albeit limited, I think might help to kind of nudge the Tories back to the centre. I don't know how it goes. I just don't think there's anybody. I think there's virtually nobody left. I think it could almost be existential for them. I genuinely wonder about that. What I don't subscribe to, this idea that to have a functioning democracy, we need a robust Tory party. It's like they can bottom out now, and this gives Labour a chance to actually get on with an agenda.
Just finally then, I'll come to you, Chris, because I want to put a variation on the same question to you, drawing on your recent experience of the United States, because as its literal grand old party, the party of the sensible, stolid, conservative middle ground has discovered, the batshit right-wing headbanger outliers, as Tom characterises them, and that would be an eye-catching name for a new party, the sort of conservative SDB of the 21st century. They can be captured by the extremes. It could happen.
Look, I think we have to understand what's happened to republicanism. It goes back to, it has longer trails than this, but if we think back to the Tea Party movement and to Newt Gingrich and to the slowly hacking away of the centre ground, and the way media has changed in the US, where the more extreme position gets favoured, and social media, and there is a confluence of factors that you slowly, frankly, get more and more eyeballs and ears to your, as Tom describes it, batshit views. And I think that we're in a similar-ish moment here with Reform, but I have to sort of slightly temper the fears around Reform in this country slightly. Yes, this is the first time after, 7 times of trying Nigel Farage has entered Parliament. If you look again, I think the personnel question is really important here. I mean, what Reform managed to do in this election is make a vote for reform a vote for Nigel Farage, frankly, who does play very well, who is popular, who just through every, frankly, failure of Brexit has still emerged in the jungles in Australia eating, bugs and still being very popular on reality TV. In a way, let's face it, the Republican Party has kind of gone through the same thing. There are not merely many Republicans who are uber popular Republicans like you used to have back in the day, where there were people who necessarily weren't the leader but were people looked to as grandees and also up-and-comers who people liked. Now it's the party of Trump. Because frankly, the personnel just isn't there anymore in politics in both sides of the Atlantic to make it work. So just to come back to as I say, to the reform thing, I think that while they have a big vote share here, and you can't get away from that. I think, and forgive me if I've got the numbers slightly wrong, 12 to 13% of the vote share, but only 1% of the seats do they actually occupy in the House of Parliament. I think that there just isn't that talent these days to get the kind of broad mix that you actually need in politics to make party democracy work successfully, where you have various voices all coming together. Instead, you've just got so much at the apex, be it Donald Trump or, to a much more kind of smaller and sillier version, Nigel Farage. You have these big players who just overwhelm the system and the structures. And so I think that's really what we found both sides of the Atlantic is caught in that cult of personality, for want of a better term.
Chris Lord, Christy O'Grady and Tom Edwards, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. The United Kingdom's general election is, of course, very, very far from the only election which is happening around the world this year, 2024's Great Democracy Off. Our next guest knows that better than most. It is Bruno Kaufmann, journalist and the Swiss Broadcasting Company's global democracy correspondent. Bruno, first of all, on that extremely enviable sounding title, does that mean that you basically spend your life traipsing around the world musing on other people's elections?
A little bit, but it's of course much more than that. Democracy is not just elections. It's also about the freedom of press. It's about how local governments do. So there's a lot to cover.
What have you made of the UK's general election?
I mean, I'm always fascinated to see an election going on and to see how the result is expected or not expected, and how the change of power works. I mean, I was pleased to see how peaceful this happens here, how everybody is agreeing to that now there's a new government. But on the other side, of course, I was also a little bit shocked about that such a result, which is so, in a way, unclear, creates such a clear government. That's something which I think is a challenge to representative democracy.
It is. Every electoral system has its quirks, and a couple of the quirks that the UK's has is one is the first past the post thing, which does give an advantage to the party which can figure out where to best direct its resources rather than necessarily to widen its popular appeal. But the other thing you allude to, which I did want to ask about how it is seen from overseas, because it is a feature of the Westminster system. It's much like this where I come from in Australia as well, that there's no transition period for either the outgoing government or the incoming government. It is, in fact, actually kind of brutal. If you've lost the election, almost literally the removal truck pulls up outside 10 Downing Street and it's not your house anymore. You're done.
That's right. See, Mr. Hunt leaving his family, and then Mr. Sunak leaving his family. It's quite a theatre. I mean, it's fascinating to see, and it's of course there's a beauty in it because it makes things so clear, and people really understand this guy is out, this new guy comes in.
I was struck by the outgoing statements of both Jeremy Hunt, the now former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and by the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's resignation speech. Jeremy Hunt was very careful to talk about the importance of the peaceful transfer of power. Rishi Sunak went out of his way to be extremely generous and graceful about the new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Did it strike you, or does it strike you, given your experience of seeing how democracy is progressing or not around the world, that both of those were important, to make that little reminder that even in a democracy as stable as Britain's, we shouldn't take this stuff for granted? It doesn't happen just by itself. It's not the default.
That's right. I mean, that's obviously reconfirming that, but it's also linked to these persons, I mean, we have seen other prime ministers here who are not as kind to others than these two gentlemen. So it's also a little bit these personalities. And in a way, I feel that in most countries, in fact, the change of powers in a democracy are quite well organized. Britain is not the unique case. I was recently in South Korea seeing both sides really taking seriously on the result and accepting the result and underlining the result. I was in Finland at the election of the new president. The new president went first to his opponent's election night to congratulate him and to say to him, "You are the nicest guy I ever met." So these kind of things are, I feel, nowadays, people are a little bit more conscious because we have had January 6th in the US that you have to take more care about how these kind of traditions are evolving. And you have to be a little bit friendlier that maybe it wasn't the tradition in the past.
But as you look at democracy up close around the world, do you get any sense that it's percolating through to actual electorates, that stuff like that does actually matter? Because democracy only works as long as it is maintained by the citizens of those countries. Do you worry that it is taken for granted even after an event like January the 6th in the United States, which surely demonstrated that it is, if it's under threat in the United States, it can be under threat anywhere?
That's right. I mean, it's important to show this and to underline this, and leaders have a very important role in that. But in fact, most importantly is, of course, what happens between election days, how people are heard, how they feel they are respected. And that's the big problem of our representative democracies today, that it's obviously easy, or more or less easy, to say nice, kind words on election day or the day after and to respect the vote. But that's not enough, because in an election campaign, in a political system of today, there are so many things which are directly approaching the people and the people's daily life. And to respect that is much harder. And I mean, the new government here in the UK will have a very short honeymoon. It will be very harsh to them in a few weeks' time already how they deliver. So I would say what is more important maybe than even these traditions of changes of power is how we develop our democracies, how democracies are developing for everyday life. So citizens not just are consumers of democracy and politics, but also taking responsibility and feel that it's up to them to make a difference.
I mean, with due acknowledgement for all the reasons you've just outlined, democracy is about much more than just elections. Nevertheless, it's elections where democracy is expressed. That's where the people get to have their say. Which one are you off to see next?
Yeah, I mean, it's in 2 days we will have the second round of the elections in France. I was just there, and it will be extremely interesting to see how the results of this election will shape France, because we can see there is the whole spectra from an absolute majority of the hard right to a much more broader coalition of parties from the left to the center. So it's really exciting to see, and I expect, in fact, that the second option will happen, because many parties now are candidates have retracted their candidacy to make this kind of coalition possible, and that could be a big advance for France.
Bruno Kaufmann, thank you. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and over the last few hours, the UK's new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has been confirming his cabinet. No surprises as of this broadcast. He is not, however, the only recently elected, or for the purposes of this seamless link, re-elected leader who has recently had to do something of this sort. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa confirmed his new cabinet this week, drawn from the first coalition government in South Africa's post-apartheid history. Well, I'm joined now by Angelica Jobson, a Monocle contributor from Johannesburg. I guess the obvious question, Angelica, are there any massive surprises in President Ramaphosa's cabinet?
I think the surprise is really that it is very, very much his cabinet. And as you'll know from the election results, the ANC did abysmally. It's the worst result that they've had.
Certainly by
they
their
came to power.
standards, yes.
Exactly. No one really knew how this coalition would shape up. They won 40% of the vote, but he has managed to negotiate, and he is known as such a skillful negotiator, 60% of the seats staying with the ANC.
Do we know how he did that? I guess what I'm really asking there is, do we understand how the ANC's coalition partners did not see him coming?
Well, the DA, for example, they had wanted 11 seats to begin with, and he managed to get them down to 6. It wasn't a very pretty negotiation by any means. There was deadlock. There was no love lost between any of the sides. Just last week before the announcement, Cyril Ramaphosa accused the head of the DA, John Steenhuisen, of trying to run a parallel government against the Constitution, for example. So it was by no means smooth sailing between the two. I think there was that side of it, but I think his experience in negotiating deals over his lifetime at the ANC really came to the fore. And I think the DA were just matched, or they really, really couldn't match his negotiating power.
Because this is certainly, to the casual observer, I think probably one of the more intriguing aspects of this coalition, that it does include both the ANC, who have governed since apartheid ended 30 years ago and have acquired something of a sense of entitlement, and the Democratic Alliance, their great rivals, often caricatured, possibly not altogether fairly, as essentially the last remaining party of white people in South Africa. Admittedly, as the DA would be at pains to stress, nice liberal white people, but nonetheless white people. How deep and how bitter does that rivalry run?
That is, for one, you couldn't get further away from having them and how they're seen. And as you say, they would absolutely disagree with your characterization and the characterization of many. But at the same time, they're sitting next to the Party of Liberation. So that couldn't go further. But you do have deeper divides, for example, on economic policy, where the ANC's economic policy is really built on black economic empowerment, which they say redresses everything that happened from apartheid. The DA is free market economics. They want to push for free market. They see these policies as holding the country back. So while there is the kind of legacy, there is the optics of how different they are from each other. But there are policies as well that they will be at lengths to wrangle over. And you can see in the appointments that Cyril Ramaphosa has made, he has kept the DA very far away from that. He has kept all the economic posts to himself.
I mean, there are other parties involved as well, though. Are they going to have a significant role?
It's seen that there are 7 in total in this coalition. So we have 32 cabinet seats. 6 of them have gone to the DA, but Ramaphosa has also diluted their influence by giving 6 others to smaller parties, and actually quite surprising small parties. It's the most ideological, diverse cabinet that you could imagine. We have the Pan-Africanist Congress, who, for example, was campaigning on decolonization of land, but you also have parties that come from the kind of right-wing, very much white interest roots that have been included as well. And so you can't imagine ideologically more different. Some could say diverse, and he's called this a national unity government. When you look at the players who are included, that's what it says. It does what it says on the tin. How closely they'll be able to work together to get something done remains to be seen.
Well, yes, there's often not all that much difference between national unity government and ferrets in a sack. It does prompt the obvious question of how confident is everybody, or indeed anybody, that this is going to last?
Well, the market certainly cheered up when the announcement was made, but that can also be seen as just really a sigh of relief that this deadlock that's taken a month to happen has finally ended. You do have a coalition of former enemies. It's not going to be easy at all, and if anything about this negotiation to go by, it's going to be very, very difficult. You can see some concessions, I guess, or some strategic decisions that Ramaphosa has made to be inclusive, but like you say, on one hand, that's inclusive if everyone's working together and pulling in the same direction. That really comes back to the foundation of what the country post-apartheid and democratically wanted. It could also spell disaster.
Just in the short term then, because the short term maybe all this arrangement has, what strikes you as a likely looming point of crisis?
I think that It is early days. We haven't really seen them get up to very, very much at all yet. I think that a particular appointment that was interesting is John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, wanted to become the deputy president. He was given the post of Minister of Agriculture. So in some ways that can seem as a smaller post, but on the other hand, actually, it will allay the fears of white farmers, for example, who do worry about land reform. Mm-hmm. And that is a flashpoint in the country. So while Ramaphosa has done that on one side, he's also created a new post looking at land reform, and he's given that position to the Pan-Africanist Congress. And as I said, they've really campaigned on the decolonization of land. So make that of what you will, that makes a very, very difficult kind of situation. People see that he's done that because, of course, we had Kontewe Sizwe, and we have had the Economic Freedom Front under Julius Malema, who really campaigned on that issue. And I'd say that's one issue that really has plagued the country since democracy and hasn't been solved. And when you look at the way Ramaphosa has split that cabinet and the two people that he's put in there, is that going to bring it to the front, and will there finally be some kind of answer to that?
Angelica Jobson, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and finally on today's show, the prospect of new ownership of a given sports club tends to evoke mixed feelings in the fans of said sports club. While they may well fancy some of the success that fresh investment may well provide, they will also fret over the many, many cautionary tales of such takeovers being scuppered by mutual incomprehension and sinking in rancour. Keen to avoid such pitfalls are fans of venerable Paris football club Red Star and their incoming owners, the American property investors Todd Interests. I spoke to Sean Todd and Philip Todd of Todd Interests at Midori House earlier. They are under exclusive agreement to acquire Red Star. I began by asking them what about the football club appealed to them.
When you look at the fan base of the oldest team in France, in Paris, look at the fans, look at the history, the nostalgia, the origins. In fact, Philip, talk about the origins of the team.
Yeah, the history of Red Star is really one of the reasons we've been drawn towards this acquisition. The club was founded in 1897 in Paris. They literally played their first games on the Champs de Mars right out front of the Eiffel Tower, and founded by a figure, if you're a football fan or a footballer, you know really well, in Jules Rimet.
After whom the first World Cup trophy was named.
Yes, exactly, and the founder of FIFA and the World Cup. And so founded in a cafe in Paris, very Parisian in that nature, and named it, we believe, after the Red Star line, which was a very interesting embargoed shipping line at the time. So
the name Red Star, of course, has come to have other connotations, and it is my understanding that the political culture around Red Star FC has, well, it's become everything you would associate with the phrase Red Star. How suspicious or otherwise have they been so far of the idea of Texan property developers?
I think suspicion is a broadly defined word. I would say a loss of expectations. I mean, fans are the zeitgeist of a team. Mm. And this is a faithful fan that has followed this team from League One to League Two to Three. They haven't been in League Two in, I think, a decade. And now they've just made it back. Mm. And obviously there have been frustrations. I can't empathize because we've not been a lifetime fan. But seeing the sincerity of the people, the following of the people of this fan base, a lot of promises were made. Big promises made.
This is by the current owners, 777.
That haven't come about. You have a new you have a historic stadium, very much being preserved, restored, and expanded in the charm of what, candidly, I would say a great English-British club. This neighborhood feels like Marlborough.
Don't say that to the French.
And I think the story of Red Star is less about politics and more about football and the fan and the community. And when you look at it, it's a fan base that's very passionate. It's a very historic fan base. I mean, they've won 5 Coupe de France titles, right? And dating back to what we learned there, and I think it's a club of the people, all people, and really a couple central things. Buying into football, right, first. Secondarily, buying into the Oddonian culture. San Juan's an amazing community that's much more than just football. We've had a chance to chat with the mayor, which we can talk about a little bit. He's very impressive, and the community is in a really great spot. It's has a deep history, but it's changing. It's being more developed. It's being, how would you say, Sean?
Ownership needs to be about the community. Mm. And I think about people. Any good business venture we've ever been a part of, thankfully many, have been about people. The community needs to be embraced. The community needs to be informed. The fan base needs to be informed. So there's lots of questions that new ownership will be easy to answer. Expectations, you need to have a team that's doing its best to win. You need to have a team that has a solid association for the children and for the youth in the community. The greatest soccer players in the world today live within 5 kilometers of Red Star's headquarters. Yet there is no academy for Red Star. So having an academy where these fans are seeing so much of this young talent that they've seen grow up from grade school, from 10 and under. In fact, I think the team just won the 10 and under league in the greater district. Having an academy that Red Star can see these young men play on this team, the women's team. Having a women's team that the prospects of the women's team we think are unlimited.
Yeah, it's impressive to see the women's team grow, and we think that's a very unique positioning in sports as a whole, just women's athletics as a whole.
But that talk about investment in academy, in the community, is that a partial answer to the question of whether you've seen missteps made by other American acquisitions of European clubs and sort of learnt what not to do and how not to go about it?
I think it's more as an observation of what we've seen in this local community and what's been transpiring. You know, the context of foreign ownership of teams, fans want to be told the truth. Fans want to feel a part. And teams are always going to lose and they're always going to win. You have look at this team. They've been doing a lot of losing over the past few years. But the fans are there, they're resilient. It's part of their life, it's part of their culture, it's part of their community. It's there every day.
Would you be willing to put a time frame on a return to the absolute top flight of French football for Red Star?
I don't think we want to put a time frame on that.
I'll go on.
I think stability is one thing that this club is hoping for and asking for, and that's something that if we were able to purchase the team, that'd be one of our main objectives, is to operate the club in a stable fashion that supports the fan and supports the game. Is that fair to say, Sean?
Yeah, and Andrew, I think many of these owners that I understand frustration, a lot of these groups are buying teams the day they're buying, they're thinking about how they're selling. And value is defined in many ways. Putting your head down, working hard, a strong work ethic, paying attention, being mindful. Over time, value is really created. Community, relationship, trust are created over a time period when you see how someone acts and how they react. Their words should be consistent with what they're doing.
And just finally then, because I know as a sports fan myself, if not necessarily a paid-up fan of Red Star, that there is nobody more, I guess, defensive, sentimental, even paranoid than the lifelong fan of a particular sports team. They, by which I mean we, essentially want nothing to change. We're incredibly suspicious of any idea about changing anything. What kind of interactions have you had or are you hoping to have with Red Star's actual fans?
I can tell you the very first meeting we had when we landed in Paris were with 4 representatives of the fan club. That's the very first meeting we had. Of any meeting we had, not the mayor, not the owners, not media, not anyone else in the community, with the 4 passionate, honorable gentlemen that the care, it was as if it was their own flesh and blood and their own child. And the questions were good questions. Some we could answer, some we couldn't, some we didn't have the answer to.
What kind of questions were they asking?
I'll let them express that to you when you get a chance to chat with them. And I would say there's frustration with what's happened. There's skepticism. There were questions that you could tell the heart behind every question. No question was offensive because you could see the passion and the heart behind it. And that's where I think trust begins, is when you see consistency with what your daily words say and your daily actions over a period of time.
That was Sean and Philip Todd of Todd Interests, incoming owners of Red Star Football Club of Paris. And that's all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our guests today, Monocle's finest, who you heard at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Henry Ree Sheridan and researched by Sana Jumani and Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend.